Hi, Assalamualaikum and a very good evening. Welcome to our first series of FSSH Adjunct Professor Series. So today we are very delightful because we have a very important guest with us today. Okay, this Professor Keith Tabor is he's very popular. He's well known because of his, research area. And then he is a professor in University of Cambridge, England. He also a senior member of Honorary College, Cambridge in faculty for 20 years. I mean, that's so long. And he also the Royal Society of Chemistry Education, where his main interest is in science education, teaching and learning in science. Okay. Without further ado, we would like to welcome Professor Keith Tabor with us. But before that, I would like to invite our chair, Professor Dr. Fatin Alia Pang, with us today. Welcome, Professor Fatin Alia Pang.
Hi, Assalamualaikum and good afternoon. Thanks, Nina. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, good. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof, for bringing Prof. Keith Tabor with us today. I mean, we are so
It's my
lucky
honor.
to have you.
It's my honor to have him to agree to be our adjunct professor.
Oh my God. And I am so happy to know that you are my teacher and I get to know your teacher. So it was like a few level of teachers, right? So I'll pass the stage to you.
Okay, thank you, Nina. Hi, Assalamualaikum and good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today at this is our very first adjunct professor lecture series. At Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, we have 4 adjunct professors, and this is the first one that we have for our lecture series. With Professor Dr. Keith S. Tabor from University of Cambridge. Tomorrow, we're going to have one more with Dato' Freda Muhammad Pilus, the founder of Cempaka School. And another one, after that, the next week on the 13th of September, we're going to have a lecture series with Dato' Dr. Habibah Abdul Rahman, the Director of Education, Ministry of Education, Malaysia. So before I invite Keith, I call him Keith. He is my supervisor. When I did my PhD in Cambridge, he's my supervisor. He is a professor of science education at University of Cambridge, the Faculty of Education at University of Cambridge. He is a fellow at the Royal Chemistry Society, and also a fellow. You have to hear this. He is not just a fellow of Royal Society of Chemistry. He's also a fellow of Institute of Physics. So you can know that his background is not just chemistry, but physics and more. He is an expert in science education, chemistry or physics education. So he has a lot in his background. He has been a teacher, chemistry teacher at schools, and he has been a lecturer at University of Cambridge since 1999. Beside that, he is also a member of the Homerton College, Cambridge. So it's really my honor to have him over and for him accepting our invitation to be our adjunct professor. So let me welcome Prof. Dr. Keith S. Tabor to join us.
Thank you, Fatin.
Hi, Keith. How are you?
I would say good morning, but good afternoon, I should say, shouldn't I?
Yeah, but it's all right. It's a recording, so people will have to will look at the video later, and it would be morning or night, it would be afternoon, evening. It doesn't really matter anyway. But it's really nice to see you. I don't know. I left Cambridge in 2009, and this is 2020. So I think this is the first time I met you after so long.
Yeah, and you haven't changed a bit, and I've just got old.
Yeah, I think that's an Asian thing maybe. So like we don't actually age a lot, but anyway, I take that as a compliment. But you do look nice. You grow beard and things like that. So I think you look really good now. I hope I can learn more from you. I really enjoy listening to you every time of the supervision. When I remember we were at your office, you chat a lot about random things, not just about my PhD, but a lot of things that I learned from you. But it's a really good chat. I love them. I hope to hear more from you. So today you are going to share with us a title of a lecture entitled "Disseminating Research Through in High Impact Journals: Some Challenges and Strategies." For the audience information, Keith, in Malaysia, we look at hash index and citation. So Keith, his Scopus hash index is 28. That's a lot, which means like 28 papers have been cited at least 28 times. The total citation is around 800. So he has published widely, a lot of papers published at high impact journals, and cited, very widely cited by many other authors. So I think we don't want to miss this. We don't want to miss a learning from you. So can you please tell us how to do it? And so I leave this stage for you.
Thank you very much, Fatin. Hello, everybody. I think they're going to show you some slides in a moment, which we're going to run through. And I want to talk a little bit about getting published. And when you've been doing this as long as I have, a lot of these things seem rather obvious, but of course, they only become obvious with experience. So please excuse me if some of the things I say are obvious, but hopefully there'll be something that's new here to many of you. Next slide, please. We all know that in academia, we're often judged by getting published. And as Fatin has indicated, not only getting published, but getting published in the journals that get noticed, getting published and then getting cited. So for many people in academic, there's a big pressure to publish. The question is, how can we do that without compromising the things that are important to us? Next slide, please. And of course, all of you will know that we're now in a situation with a lot of open access journals, and that means that sometimes we're being asked to pay money to get published, either from our department funds or from project funds, or perhaps even from our own pockets. We also know, of course, that it's very important in scholarly matters to be totally honest, and sometimes being totally honest may not seem the best way to get something published, but we know that's very important. And we also know that sometimes people tell us we've got more chance of getting published if we worked in some other area other than the area that really interests us. And of course, it's important not only to get published, but also to work on things you really care about and you're really interested in. So we don't want to compromise on these things. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to say a lot about this, but I just think as a background, I imagine we would all agree that we want to maintain the highest academic standards. We want to maintain ethical dealings with all those people we're working with, research participants, colleagues, journals, and so on. We want to be fair and respectful in our behavior of other people. And we want to make sure that when we report with honest accounts of our research and giving the full details, at least the full pertinent details. So these are things I think we can just all take for granted. So we're working within this kind of assumption that we want to be good people, we want to be honest people and do our best, but we still want to get published in the best places as possible. Next slide, please. And one of the things that's very important to realize is that getting published isn't just about writing good articles, because of course the whole thing is a process. So actually getting published means writing articles in very good quality language, and often that means in good quality English, because many of the top journals are in English, and that may be a problem for people whose first language is in English. I've been extremely lucky in that sense that my only language is English. The only language I have any competence at all is English, and I'm very lucky because most of the major journals are in English. That's not everybody's luck. We need to make sure we try and get published in the right journals for the particular research we're doing, and that's only going to happen if we've executed our studies very well, and that's only likely to happen if we designed our studies very well, and that's only likely to happen if we've conceptualized our research very well. So the whole thing is a process, and perhaps we're in a better position when we're working in some kind of research program rather than just thinking about individual studies. Now, these are points I'll be saying a little bit more about as we go through. Next slide, please. It's probably worth quickly saying something about how most journals work, most academic journals. Usually, when you submit a paper to a journal, there's something called screening, which is that somebody looks at the paper to decide if it's suitable for sending to peer review. Often that will be an editor, but sometimes it will be an administrator, and that can make a little bit of difference. If it's an administrator, they may be primarily looking at things like, is the paper longer than our maximum length? Does the paper have headings that we've said have to be included? Have they got the right kind of acknowledgements or the right kind of blinding? So mostly technical issues. If it's a journal where the screening is done by an editor, they will also be looking quite closely to make sure that the paper is about the things the journal wants to publish about within its remit. And they'll also be looking to some extent to see if there's a prima facie case for research quality. So I worked as a journal editor for over 7 years, and I would reject a lot of papers on quality grounds before they went to peer review, because just a quick look at them showed, for example, they didn't have a sufficient description of the research design and methodology to allow a peer reviewer to properly judge them. And if someone can't properly judge them, there's no point sending it to them for peer review. So I actually rejected a lot of papers before they got to peer review. Assuming your paper is considered acceptable by the editor or administrator, it will be sent to peer review. Usually journals have at least 2 peer reviewers, sometimes 3, sometimes more. These will be people chosen by the journal as people with some expertise in the area of your paper. And they will be asked to evaluate your paper along the lines of, should it be published? If it should be published, are there changes that need to be made before it can be published? And at the end of that process, the editor gets these reports, reads the report, looks at the paper, and makes a decision on whether or not your paper can be accepted. Except, of course, there are a lot of papers rejected. There are very few that are actually accepted as submitted. Nearly always, even when papers are going to be accepted, there's a review stage. So you have to be prepared for that. Even if you write a very good paper and a journal wants to publish it, almost certainly there'll be some kind of review required before publication. Can we next slide, please? So the 3 things that a journal is going to be looking at when they look at your paper is, firstly, whether it's within the field. So if you're looking in an area like education, that's quite a broad field, and there'll be journals of education, and you might think that any paper on education would fit in the journal of education, but a different journal might have a different idea of where you draw the lines around education. If you go for social sciences, that's obviously even broader. If you go for something like science education or chemistry education or technology in education, then you're doing something more specific. And the journal will only accept papers they think fit that particular field. Some papers, it isn't so much about the topic as about the approach. So, for example, there are journals that will only publish research done from, say, a feminist perspective or a socio-cultural perspective. And again, if you send in a paper that isn't of the right kind, it won't get accepted. That may be spotted at the screening stage, in which case you won't have wasted a lot of time. But sometimes these things go through to peer reviewers, and it's several months before the peer reviewers report back to the editor, and the editor reports back to you that we didn't think your paper was fitting with the journal. Assuming that the fit is correct, then there's the question of, is the work of high quality? Because obviously a journal will only want to publish high quality work. What exactly counts as high quality? High quality is obviously down to different reviewers and editors, although there are some general things, and it will depend to some extent on the journal. So there's a whole range of journals out there, and some of them, quite honestly, are publishing material that is very poor, but the good quality journals obviously are much more selective, and some are more selective than others. Although most people agree on what makes a quality article, the third point is novelty. And journals tend to want to publish work that is seen as original, rather than work that's seen to rework material that's been published a lot of times before. Therefore, you not only have to do work that's of high quality, you have to persuade the editor and the peer reviewers that you've done something that's original enough to be deserved publishing. Again, this will vary according to journal. So the very top journals are particularly strong on wanting work that's original, that's going to have an impact on the field, whereas less highly classed journals, less well-respected journals, less prestigious journals, will take quality as being important, but won't make such high demands on novelty simply because they're in a competitive marketplace and they're not able to do that, because obviously people try and get their papers published in the best journals. So it's a bit like applying for university. You know, if you apply for a very top university, you know it's a very competitive situation. If you apply for a university that doesn't have a lot of demand, there's a much better chance of getting in. So decisions have to be made when you decide to submit. Go to the next slide, please. So something that's very important is selecting the journal that you're going to submit to. Presuming that you make sure you do fit within the scope of the journal, you have to think about whether you want to go for a specialist journal or a journal with some breadth. So if you want to publish in a very specialist journal, it's more likely to be seen by people working in that topic. Although these days with the internet, people can search things wherever they are, but people who take journals tend to read papers in their own area. If you go for a broad journal, if you go for a journal of education that takes topic anything in education, or a social sciences journal that takes anything in social sciences, they're clearly going to be more selective in a way because they're getting such a wider range of material. So you've got to think about who you want to send your work to be read by. You also need to think a little bit about word limits, because some journals are very strict on only taking papers of up to 5,000 words or 7,000 words or 6,000 words, sometimes even less. And there are other journals that will let you write much longer papers. I wouldn't advise you to deliberately write a long paper. You know, the usual advice is be as precise and concise as you possibly can. But there's some material that you just can't do justice to in a short paper. And then if you're going to try and send it to a journal that has a very short word length limit, then that may be problematic. You may be better off choosing a journal that gives you a little bit more scope for expanding on your writing. You also need to think about the publication model, partly in terms of cost. If you have a budget, then obviously you can pay to get gold standard open access. If you don't have a budget, then you may be restricted to the journals that don't charge money. When I came into this area of work some decades ago, in my field of science education, I could basically assume that if a journal was asking for money, I could ignore it, because all the good journals worked on a publication model that authors were not charged to publish their work because people were buying the journals and that's how it was paid for. Nowadays with open access, there's a much more mixed economy out there. So there are very good journals that charge money, but there's also a lot of predatory journals that will publish more or less anything and are just there to take people's money. But it's not just about money, it's also about things like, is it only an online journal, or is it online and paper, or is it paper alone? Because you want to think about how people go to access your work and how quickly things get published. Some of the traditional journals in science education used to take a very long time to get published. So you'd submit and maybe you'd get the editor's decision 3 or 4 months later. They'd ask for revisions. By the time they'd done the revisions and sent it back, there'd be another 3, 4, 5 months delay. There might be another cycle of short revisions. And so it's quite possible it might be a year or so between submission and getting a final agreement to publish. And then the actual publication might be 6 months or a year later after that. Nowadays, things have speeded up considerably, but there are some journals that are very fast and some journals that still take months and months and months. The journal I used to edit for, the Royal Society of Chemistry, used to try and get editorial decisions within about a month, although having a good decision was more important than a speedy one, and would actually publish a paper on the day it was accepted, which is obviously quite extreme. It had to be published initially in a kind of manuscript form, and then that would be replaced by a proofread and tidied version about 2 or 3 weeks later. But that was one of the quickest. So you want to look at these journals, and mostly journals will have an indication of when papers are submitted and when they were published. And that gives you an idea of how long it's taken typically for a paper to go through the system. Then, of course, journal quality. You want to be published in a journal that's recognized. I understand at your university, you're given guidance on which indices to look at to see which journals are acceptable. Even within that, of course, there'll be different journals that are considered to be more prestigious than others. You want to be in the most prestigious journal possible, of course. But on the other hand, if you go for the most prestigious journal, you've got to accept there's a fair chance your work will be rejected, even if it's high quality, because it may not be seen to be original enough. And the final point I just mentioned is contingency, because if you decide, say you're going to publish a paper in Studies in Science Education, that's a journal that specializes in reviews of areas of research. So you might write a review of an area of research that's 20,000 words long, which Studies in Science Education potentially might publish. But then they might look at it and say it doesn't meet their needs, it isn't good enough, and they don't want to publish it. where are you going to send it next? Because if you've got a 20,000 word paper, which is a review of an area of literature, I'm not aware of many other journals that would accept that. So you want to think about, if I don't get into the journal I'm aiming for, are there other journals I can submit to without having to completely rewrite the paper from scratch? Next slide, please. A lot of good writing is actually about what you do before you start writing. For instance, you shouldn't have an argument about authorship at the point where people are writing the paper. So if it's a jointly authored paper from a project, everybody should have agreed right at the start who counts as an author, who's doing enough input to count as an author, and what the order of names is going to be on papers when you're actually planning the process. Also, you've chosen the journal you're hoping to publish in before you sit down to write, so you can look at the journal instructions, and if it says we require these particular headings, you must have a heading that says introduction, or some journals say you must not have a heading that says introduction, you're following their particular requirements right from the start. Obviously, if you do then later resubmit to another journal, that needs to be changed, but at least you're getting it right for the journal you're intending to publish in. Next slide, please. But even before that, the quality of a publication obviously depends on the quality of the research you're doing. And that means having a coherent research plan. And when we do research, and that diagram is a little bit small, but what we're meant to take from that is as a flow through the process of research, and everything follows on from everything else. So if you have a coherent study, your conclusions follow logically from your analysis of data, and the analysis was done in a way that makes sense in terms of your conceptualization and your choice of methodology, and the data you collected is collected in accord with a research design that's designed particularly to respond to your research questions, and your research questions have been framed in terms of your conceptualization of the topic and possibly from the theoretical perspective you're choosing. So the whole thing has a logic all the way through. If you have a badly planned project, then it's very unlikely you'll be able to have a good research study. It's possible to have a good research study and write it up badly, but it's not really possible to have a bad research study and make something of it at the writing stage. Next slide, please. So the quality of the actual study you're doing is very, very important. When you do your literature review, what you've got to bear in mind is a literature review is not simply an annotated bibliography. A literature review isn't simply finding all the relevant literature on a topic and making notes on it. A literature review is an original piece of thinking that finds a way to conceptualize the field. How can I best conceptualize all the research that's been done? How can I best understand it? Which concepts are key and how do they link together? And possibly you'll choose a theoretical perspective. So in some areas of research, particularly in areas like education and social sciences more generally, you can look at a particular situation, maybe a school classroom, and you can look at it from a number of, say, psychological viewpoints or a number of sociological viewpoints. And each of those will give you something different about that situation. So picking the right theoretical perspective, Foucault, or Bourdieu, or Piaget, or Vygotsky, or whatever, can help you frame your research questions in a way that informs your research design. And again, if you have a good conceptualization of the field, if you've got a very effective way of thinking about the project, that doesn't ensure that you're going to end up with a well-written paper. But if you have a very weak conceptualization of the project, everything after that is also going to weak, and it's very unlikely you'll have a good paper out of it. Next slide, please. So a core issue there are the research questions. And the research questions act as a kind of pivot around a research study. They reflect the work you've done up to that point in reviewing the literature. They also set out the basis for designing the research, collecting the data, analysing the research. And when you look at a good research question in a paper, there are things that you should be able to infer from that. So you can look at a research question in a published paper and you can say, oh, I see the research question says this. Say they are assuming something, because you wouldn't ask that research question unless you're assuming some particular thing. That thing that's being assumed should be found earlier in the paper, in the introduction, when it sets out the literature review. The research question may have technical terms that need defining, so they need to be defined in the paper. the research question implies what needs to be done to answer the question. So that should shape the research design. So when you look at good paper, you read the research questions, you can often pretty well guess what the research design is going to be in outline. And if it's a surprise, that's probably a problem. And there are also going to be caveats. So people have research questions like, what do 14 to 15-year-old learners, bom, 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 bom. Well, you're never going to be able to answer a question about 14 to 15-year-old learners. You might be able to answer a question about 14 to 15-year-old learners learning maths in a school in Kuala Lumpur, perhaps. But you're never going to know about all 14 to 15-year-old learners, or all maths teachers, or all science teachers, or all secondary schools. So there's always going to be caveats about the things that the research can't realistically do, and caveats about limitations in methodology and so on. So all of that really is implicit research questions. Again, the research questions right is very, very important. Next slide, please. And that links to when we're writing research, because research writing is a certain type of genre. Or as the philosopher Wittgenstein would have said, it's a particular kind of language game. And the purpose of writing a research report is that you have an argument supporting a specific knowledge claim. So although we might think of the research report as something that travels in time, starting at the beginning and going to the end, it's when you get to the end of the research, when you've completed the research, when you've got your findings, when you've drawn your conclusions, when you've decided what the implications of your research are, you can look at those conclusions and you say, well, that's what I concluded from the research. How do I lay out how we got to these conclusions? So a good research paper is a logical, straightforward argument for why somebody should accept your knowledge claims, your conclusions. And all the things that are irrelevant to that shouldn't really appear in the paper, even if you found them quite interesting at the time. So you want to do full reporting in the sense that you don't leave out relevant matters, but you don't want to fill all the details of the study that didn't turn out to be relevant to that particular point you're making in the paper. And it may well be that a good research study leads to a number of different papers, leading to different conclusions that you want to argue about differently. They're still consistent, they're part of the same study, but maybe one paper is making one argument about one particular conclusion. Next slide, please. So when we think about our research writing, there's really three things that might be helpful to think about. And one is a kind of literary analogy, which is somebody reading the paper has to follow the narrative. So what you did was probably quite complicated, quite technical, took place over a long period of time, but somebody reading it has got to see the story. It's got to follow in a way that's readable to somebody who doesn't know about the research. And associated with that, as a writer of research, you're a kind of teacher. And many of you in an education faculty, of course, will already be very good at being teachers. But as a teacher, you have a pedagogic role in writing. So you're the expert on this study. You, your author team, know about this study more than anybody else in the universe. So part of your job is to teach people about the research. So you have to communicate information in an appropriate way. You have to make the unfamiliar familiar, just as you do in teaching. And that might mean using metaphor, analogy, simile, and so forth. The kind of things you would do in teaching, drawing comparisons with things that people already know about. Everybody knows about this research, but this happened, or we found something quite similar here. And as I've already mentioned in the previous slide, the final thing is the kind of legal analogy. Your job when writing this paper is like a barrister in court who's making an argument for why somebody is guilty or why somebody is innocent. You're making a claim of knowledge, and you have to set that out as a logical argument. And if you can do all these three things well, you should have a good quality piece of writing. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned a bit there about what makes for research quality, but what about novelty? Because there are many, many competent studies being done around the world today, and most of them won't get published in the top journals, not because they're not of high quality, but because people say there's nothing really original here, there's nothing really novel. So if you want to get your work published in good journals, you have to make sure it's novel and that you sell that. You explain to people why your work goes beyond what's been done before. And that may mean expanding something into a new context. It may mean certain things have been done a lot in schools, but they've never been done in colleges, or things have been done in secondary school and never been done in primary school, or certain ideas that are used a lot in language teaching, maybe could be transferred into humanities teaching. It's worth testing that out. But it's worth bearing in mind the ideas of the philosopher of science, Sir Karl Popper, who talked about how researchers should look for bold conjectures. There's little point demonstrating something that everybody assumes will be the case already. Good research takes bold steps to try and test out ideas that we don't genuinely know what the answer is going to be. So you need to actually try and explain why what you've done goes beyond what we already know and extends our knowledge. It's not going to be something that's a totally new field of research, but it is going to be something where people will say, well, we didn't know that would apply there. We didn't know this would work in those conditions. We weren't sure. But now we've got this research, we can see that. So you have to explain why what you're doing is novel. And it's not simply saying, well, no one's ever done this before with 10-year-olds studying fractions in this particular school on a Wednesday when it was raining in June. Because why would that be particularly important? So you've got to explain that, well, the reason we did this with 7 to 8-year-olds, even though it's well known it works with 10 to 11-year-olds, is because there's a good theoretical reason for not being sure that 7 to 8-year-olds will be able to deal with this. Something like that. Or the reason this has never been tried in humanities before, and the reason is because the nature of what's being learned in humanities is quite different from mathematics, where this has been done a lot. So here are the reasons why it might work in humanities. Here are the reasons why people think it might not work in humanities. And therefore, having tried this in humanities, we have genuinely found out something new. So always look for that kind of originality and make it clear in your writing what you think is original about your work. Next slide, please. And I mentioned about a research program. Everybody needs to work in a research program in one sense. As somebody comes into research when they're new, is not going to be able to start their own field of research from scratch. So you're always building on research that's out there. You're building on other researchers. But it's also healthy for you to have a personal research program where you follow a line of work and develop a line of work, a series of studies that build on each other over time. And then gradually you become somebody who knows as much about that topic as anybody. You become an expert in how to do research in that particular area. You become very good at doing research in that area. So you develop an effectiveness and expertise that makes you very good at doing that research. So it becomes easier to do the research, easier to write the papers, easier to get published. And people start writing to you and saying, will you give a talk on this? Will you contribute a chapter to my book? Those kind of things. And that, of course, also helps you get published, because once you're well known and people are making you invitations, then that helps you network, helps you develop connections, helps you learn from other researchers and so on. So don't just do the odd study here and the odd study there, or when people suggest you, why don't you look at this? Try and build up an area of research, and obviously an area of research where you have a deep interest, a real hunger to learn about this topic. Next slide, please. And I did mention earlier about English. Most of the high-ranking journals are in English. There are high-ranking journals in other languages, particularly Spanish, but for most of us, it's writing in English. If you don't write very well, then people don't get your message. People can't see your work's good, or they're not sure your work's good. And even if it could be put right, it's quite possible that you'll get a rejection at screening, where an editor will say, I can't send this to peer reviewers, they're not going to make sense of it, rewrite it. Or after peer reviewing, peer reviewers will say, I wasn't convinced, there were too many sentences I didn't understand, there were too many points that weren't clear, I'm really not sure this is making a case. So it is important to try and sort out the language. And I know that's very difficult if English isn't your first language, and for some people, it's not even their second or third language. There are professional services that will help. Obviously, they charge money, and you have to be careful because some of them are mainly about making money. But if you can avoid that and find other ways to try and improve your English, that will be very useful. Next slide, please. An institution, say a faculty of education level, maybe there can be a pool of people identified who have very strong English skills and be asked to look at other people's papers and give them feedback. Obviously, if that was a lot of work, it would have to be allowed for in workloads. If you're working in a research group, then It's clearly important to share writing with other people and get their critical view. If you're writing on your own, it's more difficult. If you can find one or two people that you're friendly with, who work in similar areas, and say, when I write a paper, when I draft a paper, can I send you the paper to give me some critical feedback? Are there things you don't understand, things you think I've made mistakes? And I'll do the same for you. Then you can get that kind of feedback and improve your writing. Because it's a great shame when you see it. I mean, the editor, the reviewer, I sometimes see papers and I think this might be really good work, but I'm really not sure because the standard of writing is so poor. So it is important to get that right. Next slide, please. Then there's the question of what do you do when you get an editor's decision? If the editor's decision is, congratulations, we're going to publish your paper as submitted, you really don't have much of a decision to make. So that is very, very rare. If the editor's decision is, I'm very sorry, we're not going to publish your work, then you have to think about, can I send it to another journal? Is there feedback from the journal saying what they didn't like about it that I can use to improve it before I send it somewhere else? Or is this work so hopeless it needs to be completely rehashed or perhaps put aside for the time being? It's more difficult in a way when you get a decision that we're not prepared to publish the work as it is, but we might publish it with some improvements. And most journals have a kind of graduation of decision. So there's something that's often called minor revisions. And if you get minor revisions, that means that the editor and reviewers do think it's good work. They do think it's worth publishing, but there are some things they think you need to address. Almost certainly it's worth addressing them if you can, because it sounds like you're going to get published. Major revisions means that they're much less sure of your being able to make the changes they want. And therefore, if you do make changes, it might still get rejected. And if they ask for a resubmission, that means they're even less confident. And for resubmission, they're really not assuring you it's going to be published at all. They're saying there may be something here. We're really not sure. If you can look at this and this and this and this and this, we'll have another look at it. So you have to decide how important is it to get in this particular journal. If it's very important, then it's more worth doing the revisions. Are the changes possible? Because sometimes reviewers say, in order to get this published, they need to do X. And you just cannot do X with the data you've got. It isn't feasible. How much work is involved? Is it going to be another couple of days, another couple of weeks, a couple of months? Are there things you're being asked to change that you feel is uncomfortable because you think it would make the report less honest or distort the work in some way? Because obviously you wouldn't want to do that. Or sometimes reviewers ask you to make changes where you think, well, I just don't agree with the reviewer. Although if I made those changes, the work might get published. If I make those changes, I don't think it's as good a paper. I mean, one of the strengths of peer review is often reviewers point out things you missed, and you can make your paper stronger by taking the advice of reviewers. But occasionally, you just disagree with the reviewers, and you think, well, I really don't agree with that. That would make the paper less strong in my view. So these are things you have to sum up. You also have to think about whether you have to change everything you've been asked to change. And that varies from journal to journal. Sometimes the language of the decision letter makes it clear that some things are suggestions and some things are required. Some journal editors are open to more discussion than others. So you need to think carefully about how much arguing you want to do, because we've got to remember the editor's decision will be final. Could we go to the next slide, please? And when you are revising, it's important to use tracking to keep track of the revisions. So I'll take your original submission file, make a copy of it to make the revision, and make that copy tracked. Even if the journal doesn't ask for tracking, and they usually do, it's useful for you while you're doing the revision process. Make a response document that carefully explains exactly what you've done and where. And I think sensibly, it's usually a good idea to make a table of everything you've been asked to change or all the suggestions made by the reviewers and editor, and then work through that table as you make the changes. That's useful for you in doing the work. And it's also useful to tidy that up and send it in as part of the response letter to show to reviewers and editor, look, I've done this, oh, I haven't done that, but this is why, and I've done this, and this is where I've done this, so they can immediately see all the changes you've made. Next slide, please. So, I mean, I hope that that wasn't just a matter of common sense, everybody knew. Basically, some key points to take away. Writing is not something separate, it's part of the overall process. So the quality of a written report depends on the quality of the whole process of doing research. You can iron out, you can change any flaws in your writing, but you can't actually change any flaws in the study itself, so you need to get things right. Think about the journal you want to write for before you sit down to write. Learn about that journal, the papers in that journal. And when you've written a paper, don't just send it off. Do take time to review it, get other people to look at it, get feedback on it, refine it, because the closer it is to perfect when you submit it, the better chance it is of getting published eventually. And when you do get asked for revisions, treat the revision process systematically and carefully. And it's a good idea whenever you submit a paper to always think, well, if they do accept it, there's going to be some revisions needed. Because I know what it's like, you get that decision letter and you thought you'd written them as this most perfect paper, because of course all my papers are perfect when I write them. And then reviewers and editors say, we don't like this, that wasn't any good, that doesn't make sense, you haven't done this. And that can be a bit of a disappointment. So you have to bear in mind, this is a process. It's like that for everybody. So when you submit, that's very seldom the end of the process. Normally it's the start of a process of one or more layers of revision. I hope very much that was helpful. Thank you very much for your time. Final slide, please.
Thank you, Prof, for sharing with us your, this is like the wisdom that you have been, your experience and wisdom of publication. And actually, I really love the analogies. You were talking about the three analogies there, the literal analogy, the and the legal. I only thought of like the legal as like whenever I write, I only have the analogies of the legal and the literal. But I never thought about the pedagogy analogy as like we were trying to teach our readers. It didn't cross my mind. So I think it is a very good analogies here. Okay, we're gonna. I'm looking at the comments here. So some of the audience says, "Nice, very helpful. Thank you very much, Prof. Keep in mind at all stages." You can have a look at the screen there, Prof. Given by the viewers. We have about 100 plus viewers here. They said whatever you've been telling us is very helpful. Let's go and have a look at some questions. Is there any questions here, Nina? Say great, nice. Thank you. Is there any question from the audience, Nina? There's more thank you coming in, but I don't see any questions yet. Maybe they're still thinking. But it's what okay, where do you get the name of the school? SMK Taman Sesajaya 2. That is very funny.
Are you saying there really is a school called that?
Did I?
Are you saying there really is a school with that name?
Yeah, there's a school with that name. Definitely there's a school with that name.
What a coincidence. Isn't that amazing?
What coincidence? The school's in Johor.
It's almost like I have access to the internet.
Oh, yeah. All right. Okay. Look, one question here. We have a question from our colleague here, Dr. Noas Niza Ibrahim. Nina, can you show? Chusari, can you show the question? So, Prof, how much of publication fee required by journals is considered as predator journal? You were talking about predator journals in the beginning of your talk. How much will you consider as? How much USD? How much pound would you say that's considered as a predator journals?
I think that's very difficult because I think some of the quality journals will charge a lot of money. So some of the journals run a hybrid model now. So some of the journals that used to be very traditional, that were they charge for subscriptions to the journal and don't charge authors, will say to authors, but if you pay us a fee, we'll make your work open access.
Yeah.
And they're asking for quite a lot of money, high hundreds of US dollars or more.
US dollar, all right.
Yeah? So I think I don't think it's about how much money. I think you've got to see what you're getting. So if you're publishing in a journal by Springer or Routledge or Wiley or someone like that who's a good publisher, and they ask you for, I don't know, $500 US for open access, then you're getting a good service. you know you're publishing in a good place. I get hundreds of emails from journals I've never heard of, and sometimes, I mean, and these are journals. I mean, I get asked to send papers. I get asked by name, to send papers to journals of medical specialisms.
Yeah,
all kinds.
we got that too.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. And sometimes they say, if you can send us your paper by such and such a date, it'll be published in the next issue. And such a date is sometimes 10 days away, less. And and they're not talking about serious peer review, are they? Yeah, they're talking about getting your paper. And then they'll say, if you haven't got a paper ready and you can't write one in 2 or 3 days, why don't you send us a note or a commentary or a case study or a book review or your shopping list? Well, they don't say a shopping list, but and that makes me very suspicious. Then there's the journals that say we have a citation index of 3.27. I think, well, lots of good journals in education are nowhere near that. So how come this journal I've never heard of has got a citation index of whatever? And then when you look at the small print, it's not Thomson's, Reuters citation index.
It's
everybody
like
else
Google index, whatever. It's like,
well, there is a company that gives these indices, and if you look on their website, they say, in order to come up with, I mean, a proper index is a measure of the average rates that a paper in that journal is cited in other well-known journals over a certain period of time. But some people are quoting citation indexes, and what they're supposedly down to things like the typography, the frequency of publication, the distribution of the journal, all kinds of random data that apparently used to make these numbers. So you have to look very carefully. If you don't know the journal, who's on the editorial board? Are there people on the editorial board who are experts? Are they working in good research universities? Who's actually doing the work? Is it an editor or is it some administrator? I mean, I got a letter once from a medical journal, and the letter was saying, we've read your paper, blah, 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 blah. And it was nothing to do with medicine. It was a science education paper. And we're very impressed, and we'd like you to write for this journal. And of course, it came from some administrator on behalf of the editor. So I looked up the editor on the internet, and the editor was a serious professional, a professor of surgery in a top American teaching university, a teaching medical school, serious person. So I emailed him directly and said, thank you for your invitation. I'm very surprised that somebody as busy for you as you has been reading my papers in science education, And of course he hadn't, but somebody on his behalf sending these emails out. So it's become a really difficult situation. So, if you're being asked for money, you really want to say, well, can I be sure that this is a decent journal where I really want to be published? Who's publishing in this journal? What's the quality of the work in this journal? Because there are so many journals now that if you're prepared to spend a few $100 US, sometimes more than a few hundred, then you can get published. You can get virtually anything published, even if they claim there's peer review. I mean, another short story. Well, just to illustrate this, some years ago, I got asked to edit a new journal that was being started up by a company that wanted to develop outlets for people working in Africa, in particular, and it was called something like the International Journal of Science and Technology Education Research or something. And I agreed to do it because I think we're genuine. I mean, I think they genuinely wanted to start a journal, do a good job. But I would get stuff that had been through peer review, and the peer reviewers have said, yes, it should be published. And I would look at it, and there'd be a paper about, I don't know, wheat growing practices in Nigeria. Nothing to do with science and technology education, just about how to grow wheat, agricultural research. And a lot of it had no methodology, no research design. They were clear and obviously very poor quality papers. Yet they've been through peer review, and the peer reviewers said they were good. Because this journal was basically, again, anybody who volunteered to peer review. So any graduate student who volunteered could peer review. The top journals could ask experts to do peer review, but peer reviewers don't get paid anything. So a lot of these new journals are really struggling to get people who know what they're doing to peer review. So in that particular journal, I asked them to change their practices. They couldn't change their practices, and I stood down not because they were predatory, but simply because they were unable to actually provide the quality of peer review that needed for a decent journal.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. Well, I think you give us lots of tips of how to see is that if that's a predator journal. I think I think there are lots of tips like look at an editorial board, the one who email you, the impact factor or the citation of the journals. I think all those things are tips for us to understand if this journal would be good for us to send our paper to. Okay.
You also have to look out because not everybody is being honest. I mean, you would assume that in the academic community there's honesty. I was invited to go and talk at a conference, and it was on a topic I knew nothing about, but that didn't stop them inviting me. And the name of the scientific committee of this conference included some people who looked very significant, Nobel Prize winners, whatever. I emailed some of these people. They didn't know they were on this list. There was a website that had the names of these people, their photographs, their biographies, saying that they were on this scientific committee. Right. They didn't know anything about it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Wow. I think I don't even know what are their real emails for me to email them. I think those kind of investigations is a long way to get to. So okay. We got one question here. Somebody from Abdul Qawi Nori. I think he's from Afghanistan, one of our master students in Afghanistan. So, what are the main reasons for rejecting a paper? Which part mostly the reviewers look deeper? Introduction, method, or discussion? Which part you, as a novice author, he's a master student. The student should focus more if he or she cannot write perfect piece of paper from the beginning to the end, which part should he or she focus more on?
I think that's the wrong way to look at it because right. The whole thing is a process. The whole thing is a kind of, it's a piece of work. And if there's a flaw in the piece of work, then that will be spotted by reviewers if there's a big flaw. So I've seen things rejected because there's no proper literature review. I've seen things rejected because the research design was inappropriate for the research questions, or because the sample selected was inappropriate, or because the wrong kind of analysis was done. I mean, sometimes it's not about. I mean, some things can be put right. So if there's a good study, but they're saying they haven't discussed enough of the major literature, then that can be done in a revision. But you need the whole thing to be good, because peer reviewers are asked to look at the whole thing, and different peer reviewers will tend to focus on different things. So the whole thing has to be good to get published, or in a good journal to get published. So things will be rejected at any stage, or at least things will be sent back for correction. Things will be told it can't be published as it is. But if you get things like the sample wrong, so for instance, if you claim you're doing experimental research where you're going to generalize to a population, and instead of having a random sample that's randomized to conditions, you just pick 2 random school classes, then there's nothing you can do at the writing up stage to make that generalizable. So if you get some basic flaws in the thinking about the research, you can't put that right later.
Then you have to claim about what limitation. You will write there are limitations in my study. So would that be it would be good enough to cover up your writing, to make up the writing?
I mean, it depends. It depends A, how clever you are, and B, what was actually we're talking about. So if you've chosen a totally inappropriate methodology for the research you're doing, there's nothing you can write at the end.
Cannot salvage the paper.
No, I mean. If there are limitations, in terms of you haven't got a perfectly representative sample, but you have a good argument, you think it's a typical sample, then you might persuade people that's good enough to make the work published. So there are things there are things you can say, and of course, if you don't make big claims, sometimes that's easier. So if you say this is a definitive piece of work which totally shows that all school children in the whole universe have this particular characteristic, then you're very unlikely to be able to write anything to demonstrate that. If you make modest claims, you're more likely to be able to support them. And sometimes provisional work, if it's novel, might get published. But if you make it sound like you're doing exploratory work, some reviewers will say, that's great, why don't you come back and submit a paper when you've done the proper study?
Right. From your experience as a reviewer, I mean, would you have that kind of? I'm not sure. As I have been reviewing, I don't have an extensive experience in reviewing papers, but sometimes I'm like looking for flaws when I review paper. I'm just when I read the papers, I'm like specifically looking for flaws and problems in the paper. Would it be? I'm not sure. Is that the your way of reading or reviewing papers as well? Like you just keep looking at the flaws, trying to find if there's any flaw in the paper.
I think if somebody looked at the reports I write for journals,
Yep.
they would say, yes, that's what you're doing. You're looking for flaws.
Yeah.
But actually, I'm not. That's not how I approach it. I read a paper to be convinced by the paper.
Right.
But if there are big flaws, they jump out at you because you think, well, why have they done that? That doesn't make sense. Or how come they're using that sample? Or why haven't they randomized if they claim this is an experiment?
Right.
You know, or well, they've used this instrument to collect data. When I look at the items in this instrument, I don't think this is measuring what they claim to be measuring. You know, so it's not that so much I'm looking for flaws. In a sense, I'm looking for the opposite. I'm looking to be persuaded. But then if you read carefully, be persuaded, you'll notice when you're not being persuaded, when you think, well, that's not right. That doesn't make sense. That's not convincing. That's what I find. Someone says there, how do you stay motivated? And I think that's very difficult. I mean, I'll tell you two quick stories, very quick stories. One is about a very famous psychologist who's a very, very big name in the intelligence field, who wrote a little article saying that when he's rejected from a journal, he sends a paper to another journal, and if they reject it, he sends it to a third journal, and if they reject it, he puts it in his drawer and leaves it, and maybe comes back and looks at it some other time. Now, I thought that was very reassuring because this is somebody incredibly highly published, highly thought after, and he's prepared to admit sometimes he gets rejected by 3 journals on the trot. But the other thing I'd say is, even though peer review is the best system we've got, there's always luck in it. It's always down to who reads your paper, what they think. So although you might be rejected by a journal, you can't let that demotivate you too much. And my other story, a very quick story that I was told by my supervisor, he sent a paper off to a journal and they rejected it. So he sent it to a second journal and they rejected it. So he sent it to a third journal and they accepted it. And then he realized he'd made a mistake. He'd accidentally sent it to the first journal a second time by mistake. Now, you're not allowed to do that. If you're rejected, you're rejected. But this was just an accident. He thought he sent it to a different journal. He got muddled. He sent it to the same journal twice. So the journal saw the same paper twice. It went to different reviewers on different occasions. Once it was rejected, once it was accepted. So obviously, you know, there are quality criteria. There are very bad papers that should never be published, and there are very good papers. But the judgments are being made by human beings. They're fallible. They're somewhat subjective. Everybody has their own biases, their own preferences, the things they think are very important, and the things they think don't matter that much. Everybody has their own ideas about what counts as a case study, you know. So you can't be too disheartened. You just have to say, I mean, if everything you ever write is rejected by everywhere you send it, you're probably in the wrong line of work. But I don't think there's anybody out there who wouldn't get rejected. We all get rejected from time to time.
Yeah, obviously. Fendi here, he's one of our lecturers, our associate professor here, and he's been highly. I mean, he has published very widely, a lot of publication, and still he's facing this kind of problem, like how to stay motivated when you keep getting rejection from like high quality, high impact journals. So I think just keep doing, keep writing. So there's a question from Sean. So he's asking, is review paper easy to get published, or would it be research paper? Review or research paper?
I think I don't have an answer to that question. I think generally it's easier to publish an empirical study because there are a lot more journals that regularly publish empirical studies. Some journals won't publish theoretical pieces or review papers. I mean, some journals do. So some journals will publish theoretical perspectives, review papers, and empirical studies. Some primarily publish empirical studies. If you're doing a review, you've got to show there's something original about the review.
Mm.
So, you know, it's still got to be original. And the fact that, well, nobody's reviewed this topic in a couple of years doesn't really count. You've got to look at it in a new way, find something new. I mean, I mentioned Studies in Science Education. That is a journal that only publishes review articles. And it's been going a long time, and it's published some of the most influential articles in science education. But there aren't many journals like that.
Right. Okay. I think you can read the screen by Dr. Akil Khan. He's our lecturer from Pakistan. So he's asking, like, there's so many papers. I mean, journals discontinued from the Scopus indexing. Scopus, for as a background, Scopus indexing is very important in Malaysia because it's one of the criteria for ranking assessment. So that's why people has been chasing after Scopus index journals. So what do you think about this question?
Well, in a way, I'm very lucky because I've never worked anywhere where these things count.
Yeah, I know.
You know, I've always been left to get on with things. When I first went to work at Homerton College, I was given advice by the people who knew about research, and it's some of the worst advice I was ever given in my life. Okay, so basically I was told, look, Keith, you're trying to publish things in these science education journals. Why don't you branch out and publish more broadly in more broad journals? Because, you know, that'll be more important. And years later, it became very clear that actually at Cambridge, if you want to get on, you're much better publishing in a very specialized area. You know, so that was really bad advice. So I think you've got to follow your heart to some extent. The very top journals aren't going to get dropped, are they? So, I mean, science education, International Journal of Science Education, research in Journal of Research in Science Teaching, research in science education, studies in science education. Those journals are always going to be well respected. But in a way, I mean, I've published a couple of things in really odd places that aren't any favoured lists. But it doesn't matter if I've got something published and I like it and I want it published. And we might find the world is changing because in some areas of physics and some of the other areas of the natural sciences, there's a lot more publishing of preprints, a lot more publishing where people put their work online and it gets reviewed after it's online. Now, in our area, in the social sciences, if you try to do that, people say, well, that doesn't count.
Yes, it doesn't count
very seriously in some areas in the natural sciences, and it may come to the social sciences as well. So I know you've got to publish a certain amount in the right journals for professional advancement. So it is important for professionally. But what really matters is you do the research you care about and interests you, and you get your work out there where people can read it. So as long as you can get some of your work into the journals other people think counts. The most important thing personally, surely, is to do the work, find out things, share your knowledge with other people. And if it comes to sticking stuff up on your own personal website, that won't count for your CV.
No, it doesn't.
But occasionally, perhaps that doesn't matter. Occasionally, perhaps what's important is the fact that your work is being shared with other people.
Yep. All right. I just want to make a correction. Dr. Akil is from India, not from Pakistan. My bad. Anyway, so I don't think we have time for any question. We have been 4 minutes over 1 hour from the time we have allocated. So any last word you want to say, Keith, before we end the session today?
Oh no,
any
yeah,
last advice?
It's very nice to talk to you all. Hope it was helpful to people. And I mean, I think you've got a copy of the PDF. I'll make sure it needs any tidying, and I'll send through a copy you can let people have if people want the copy of the PDF.
They will
some link on it.
Yeah, they were asking for the slide. Or you want to give me? I think it would be nice if you put on your personal website the slide, and then I'll just post the link on the Facebook, and so people just can go to your site and download the slide. Would that be all right?
Yeah,
or
sure.
You prefer?
Because you only say so much on the slides, I put some links to the website where there's some more information on some of the topics.
Yeah, perfect. Because they can be able to look at your website, your other publication and anything else that you want to share with them. So I think later on when you get the slide done, you just give me the link and I'll share on the Facebook and also the YouTube page, so people can have a look and at your website for all the other information you might want to share with them.
Okay.
So yeah, so thank you so much, Keith, for your time. Thank you so much for waking up so earlier just to entertain us and sharing your knowledge with us. All right, so
Have a good
thank you so
evening.
much, and yeah, you too. But before we end the session, I'll give it back to Dr. Nina to close up the session. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you so much, Prof. Keith, for a very great sharing, and as well, Prof. Atin, for moderating it very well. So thank you so much. I would like to share for our upcoming event. So we have tomorrow, we have a very special event, the Cempaka story. So don't miss out. If you know about the Cempaka story, you'll be like, okay, I have to be there at 10 a.m. in the morning just to listen to this Cempaka story by Datuk Frida Muhammad Pilus. Okay, if you find this FSSH Adjunct Professor Lecture Series is beneficial, please share, please like, and spread the good video so that everyone can benefit from this sharing. So till then, see you tomorrow. Bye.